Hello and welcome to this new episode of our podcast, Peace Today, where we talk with people from all over the world who are committed to building a more peaceful world. And today I'm very happy that I'm talking to Phil Clark, who is a professor of political studies, political science at the SOAS University in London. Um, Phil, most welcome to this program.
Thank you, Jakob.
You have been studying war and conflicts in many places, but in particular, you have been studying this in the Great Lakes region of Africa, meaning Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and Congo. Now, today we hear very little from this region. We know sometimes it comes through also in demonstrations around Palestine and Sudan, that also Congo is mentioned. People feel and know somehow that something is wrong in Congo. But I think the general knowledge about this is very little, and there's relatively extremely little attention for this war. If you compare it to what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Israel and Palestine, we rarely hear. And nowadays we hear something a little bit more about Sudan, which is also horrific to understand what kind of mass slaughter and atrocities are taking place. But this the Great Lakes region very much remains sort of a blind spot on the map. And it seems that the conflict is running there for a long time already. Could you maybe give us a short introduction about why this region has so much conflict and has lived through so many wars and violence over the past decades?
I think maybe one of the reasons the international press hasn't been paying attention to what's happening in Eastern Congo in the last year or so is the complexity of the situation, that there are a wide range of actors and a wide range of causes, I would say, for example, the conflict that we see in Eastern Congo at the moment. I mean, maybe the easiest way to understand it is that firstly, there is a state-based driver of the violence. So we see various rebel groups in Eastern Congo at the moment, many of which are being controlled, financed, directed by the other governments in the region, particularly Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. All of those states have proxy forces across the border in the DRC, and that's a key factor here. The regional governments see an opportunity in Congo, both in terms of political influence, but also economic interests. Almost all of these governments have an interest in natural resources, in timber, in the coltan trade, in the charcoal trade. It's potentially very lucrative for them. So that's what drives those governments to get involved in Eastern DRC. But at the same time, there are these really important dynamics at the local level, where we're also talking about Eastern DRC as a region where there are many localized disputes. Some of those are over land, some of that is around ethnicity and language groups. And I guess in some respects, the story of Eastern DRC over the last 20 or 25 years has been how these regional dynamics intersect with the local dynamics. You have the interest of the neighboring states, but you also have these often less visible, very complicated antagonisms at the community level. And when the two levels come together, as they have done in the last 2 or 3 years, we then see this massive escalation in violence, which is what the DRC has been experiencing for the last 3 years. And I guess the problem for the Western press is how to tell that kind of very complicated story in a very pithy way. And I think at least part of the Western media's silence around this is that complexity, trying to tell this multi-leveled story, which the press finds very difficult.
Yeah. So if we talk about the last month or let's say year almost in DRC, we know there's a lot of violence going on, and we hear uh, about rebel groups, M23, etc. Um, so they're fighting and they're killing civilians and they're gaining territory. Who are they and what are they fighting for? Just to give an example of one of these many violent episodes over the past period.
Yeah, the M23 is the most important rebel group in Eastern Congo at the moment. Most of its forces are Congolese Tutsi, so often members of the Tutsi ethnic group, but whose families have grown up in Eastern Congo over the last 30 or 40 years. So they self-identify very strongly both as Tutsi and as Congolese. They feel that they have been marginalized and sometimes have been the victims of deliberate violence by the Congolese state. And so, at least part of what's driving their rebellion is this antagonism towards Tshisekedi's government in Kinshasa. But by the same token, they're a very useful tool for particularly the Rwandan government, but to a certain extent also the Ugandan government.
Mm,
Those two states, not just at the moment, but historically have used M23 as the pointy end of the spear, have used them as proxies across the border to fight the Congolese government, capture territory, capture control of natural resources, which are very important for those neighboring states. So
mm,
M23 is a really good example, I think, of a wider dynamic that we've seen in Congo for a long time. Groups that
mm,
have local motivations, they have their own concerns about Congolese governance, and are fighting for that reason, but are also being used by the other governments in the region. So, that gives us some sense of why M23 is fighting in the way that it is.
mhm.
And of course, as you've already alluded to, that violence hasn't just been against the Congolese state, it's also been against everyday Congolese civilians with an enormous death toll for everyday Congolese over the last year or two.
Yeah. So you mentioned two countries, Uganda and Rwanda. What people know or what they remember, of course, is that there was a genocide in 1994. And it seems that ever since the whole region has turned into, maybe before there was already violence in many places, but from 1994 onwards, it went really downhill and hasn't really recovered ever, I think, since that situation. How is the current instability, let's say, linked to that episode in history?
There's a direct connection between the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda and the violence that we see in Eastern Congo, in the sense that in the 1990s, after the genocide, when the Tutsi-dominated rebel group, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, came to power in Rwanda, it led to this massive exodus of the Hutu population from Rwanda into Eastern Congo. That more than 2 million Hutu fled into refugee camps in what was then Eastern Zaire. In those refugee camps, we then saw the mobilization of Hutu militia groups, many of whom wanted to go back to Rwanda to finish the job of the genocide. Over the next few years, there was then this pitted battle between the Rwandan state and these Hutu rebel groups. And Rwanda kept sending forces across the border to try to neutralize those groups, and there was an enormous death toll. So there are years of violence in the Eastern DRC where you can best understand it as an overflow of the genocidal violence from Rwanda. Some of those Hutu groups continue to operate in Eastern Congo today, and Rwanda uses its support for M23, at least in part, as an attempt to neutralize those groups. They talk especially about a group called the FDLR. That's the largest Hutu rebel movement in Eastern Congo at the moment. If you look at the top brass of the FDLR, many of them were senior figures in the genocidal government and the genocidal military in Rwanda in 1994. So Rwanda looks at FDLR and says, in many respects, this is the continuation of the genocide. These people still want to kill us. They want to kill the Tutsi. And so we need M23 as a counterforce to try to keep that Hutu genocidal threat at bay. So there are lots of other factors playing into the current Congolese conflict, but at least some of these do have their roots in the Rwandan genocide of 1994.
And is this FDLR, is this still a reasonable, is it still a real threat, or is it more of an excuse in order to, let's say, occupy or have M23 occupy the East?
I would say it's a bit of both, in the sense that FDLR is large enough to pose a threat to various Tutsi groups in Eastern DRC. That threat is real, and many of my Tutsi friends and colleagues in North and South Kivu province of Congo talk about the reality of that threat.
Mhm.
Whether it's violence, whether it's land grabs, whether it's cattle theft, the FDLR are real.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I would say the Rwandan government exaggerates that threat. In
Mhm.
particular, they exaggerate the ability of the FDLR to cross over the Rwandan border and to threaten Tutsi inside Rwanda. I think in many respects that's a fanciful notion. And
Mhm.
that's the fanciful notion that the Rwandan state will often deploy when they're trying to justify their support for M23. So
Mhm.
FDLR is real. I think that threat is real, but it's perhaps not as extensive as Kagame's government would suggest.
Yeah, because what we often hear is that, of course, there's a lot of. I think you alluded to it as well. There's a lot of minerals and a lot of resources in to be won in Eastern Congo. I wonder. Yeah, you explained the historical context, but you also said like several countries in the region are there because of the resources. What is there exactly, and how does it work? How do these states actually use the wars to get access to these resources?
So the main resources in question are those that are most desired on the international market at the moment. It's coltan, it's diamonds, it's gold, it's a range of very lucrative minerals that are desired particularly by the likes of the US and China. And what Rwanda and Uganda do is firstly establish a legitimate trade corridor. So, what complicates this picture is that both of those states have internationally monitored trade routes that go through Kigali and Kampala with minerals that are tracked and traced and then legitimately end up on the international market. And so Rwanda and Uganda turn around and say, look, we have the support of the European Union, the US, various world powers to be involved in the mineral trade. But they then use that very legitimate corridor for a whole range of illicit mineral extraction. And they can do that because they have a military presence now in Eastern Congo. They have either their own armies across the border or they have proxy groups like the M23. And so they use what is ostensibly a legitimate mineral trade to start to do something that is much more extensive and much more lucrative for them. And much of that is underpinned by the kind of violence that we've seen in the last couple of years.
Are you saying there are actually two different streams of resources from the region, one official and one illicit?
Indeed, and they're often very difficult to disentangle from one another. So,
Mm.
as recently as 2 years ago, the European Union signed a memorandum of
Yeah.
understanding with the Rwandan state to set up this mineral extraction process, which sees many of these natural resources end up on European markets. Now, whenever Rwanda is criticized for its involvement in the mineral trade, that's the first thing they point to. They say, "Look, we have this deal with the EU. It's completely legitimate. In fact, it's been renewed by the EU even at the height of the current M23 conflict." So Rwanda says, "Look, there's nothing to see here. There's no problem. That this is exactly what the EU wants us to do." But the truth is that they then use that as a smokescreen to smuggle large quantities of natural resources, often through exactly the same channels. So it'll be the same middlemen in Kigali who are dealing with both the licit and the illicit mineral trade, and then all of that ends up on the international market, and it's producing an economic boom in Rwanda at the moment. I was in Kigali only a few months ago, and you can see the impact of this latest mineral flow. Huge construction, very wealthy, bling cars being driven all around town, a real sense of economic
Mhm.
vibrancy, of course, which is only really kept in the hands of a very small political elite and isn't trickling down to everyday Rwandans. But the tangible impact of those minerals coming across the border from Congo is really there for everyone to see.
Well, this raises very much the question then, if Rwanda uses these treaties to to commit a lot of illicit acts, and Uganda probably doing the same. This raises then the question of, let's say, our own responsibility as a well, as Western nations. I would say EU, but you're in the UK and it's not part of the EU anymore. But so of Western nations like the UK, like the European Union, like the US. How do you see this let's say the Western responsibility for what is currently happening in terms of atrocities that are part of the process, it seems, of getting the resources to the West.
I don't think there's any doubt the Western countries play an enabling role in this conflict. I think the primary actors are domestic, that the African states and the African rebel groups in particular are the main actors. But there's no doubt that the likes of the EU, that the US and others have created an environment where all of this is possible. And look, the likes of Rwanda and Uganda understand the international terrain incredibly well. That they are masterful players and masterful interpreters of international interests, and they've realized that there's a global race on for critical minerals. That they know in particular that the EU, the US, and China are in an enormous global contest for control over these resources. And so the likes of Rwanda and Uganda use that global picture to their own advantage. One of the ways that you can see this at the moment is in the latest peace deal signed between Rwanda and the DRC in Washington only a few weeks ago. Uh, the likes of Rwanda have been looking at the Russia-Ukraine deal and can see that control over natural resources is the way that you get what you want at the peace negotiating table. There's a very transactional approach to peace building that is happening under the Trump administration, and Rwanda is ready to play that game. They went to Washington and, in essence, said, we will give the US control over certain mining concessions that our proxies currently have control over, provided we get a peace deal that is constructed on our terms. That was absolutely music to the Trump administration's ears. And as a result, on paper, we now see a peace deal that skews very heavily towards Rwanda's interest rather than Congo's interest. So it shows the savviness, the agility, the global understanding of a government like Rwanda, but also this new peace building approach in which natural resources and minerals are playing a really central role. It's a very different peace terrain than we've seen in a very long
Would
time.
you call it peace, though? I mean, if it's dependent on, let's say, occupation of foreign soil and the sale of resources that are not yours, basically.
Indeed. I mean, in fact, I don't think the Washington peace deal could be really described as a peace deal in any meaningful sense.
Mm.
It's been trumpeted, no pun intended,
Yeah.
by the US government, by the Rwandan government as this magnificent agreement. But actually, it's basically a green light for
Mm.
Rwanda to continue doing what it's doing. It hasn't changed the dynamic on the ground in Eastern Congo at all.
Which is strange though, because okay, so now they can, let's say, they will accept buying resources from proxies of Rwanda, let's say, but couldn't they have just earlier got the same resources just through Kinshasa, through Congo?
That they could have, and I think, but the US was frustrated dealing with Tshisekedi's government in Kinshasa. So they had tried a wide range of mineral deals that basically the Congolese government didn't deliver on. And so instead, what we're seeing is the US using a peace process to try to get what they couldn't get through, more conventional means. The other absurdity here, and in some ways, I think this will come to a head probably in the next few months, is Rwanda is also promising to the US access to mining concessions that at the moment already involve China. And so Rwanda and Uganda's major international partners for this mineral trade in the last 5 years has been China. And so in order for Rwanda to deliver on what they promised to the US, they would have to undermine these mining deals that they've already got with the Chinese government. And that seems very unlikely. Now, what's surprising to me is that the US hasn't clocked this. The US has basically taken Rwanda at its word in Washington that it'll get what it wants in terms of mineral extraction, without really looking at the reality of the situation. So this is going to come to a head pretty soon. I think the US has been a bit slow to realize it, but they will soon enough realize actually China is the major player here,
Mm.
and the US is unlikely to get what it wants
So
out of
what
the
do you
process.
expect to happen then with this in this regard?
We'll see a US backlash, but the form it's likely to take is simply to collapse the process, the peace process.
Mm.
So, but in many respects, I'm not sure that's a great loss because this has always been a, pretty superficial process anyway. It may actually be the best thing for the US to do. for peace in the Great Lakes at the moment, for everybody to stop putting time and energy into the Washington process and think up a completely different framework, because this current framework is a complete sham. The pressure then goes back onto the previous players who were trying to negotiate a deal. So the regional players, the African Union, the East African Community, and inserted into this is Qatar. Qatar have emerged as a crucial player, obviously not just in the Rwanda-Congo situation, but in many African peace processes at the moment. I actually put much more store in what is beginning to happen in Doha. The Qatari government is at the moment mediating between the Congolese government and the M23 rebels. It's an early process, but there's some momentum there. I
Oh,
think ultimately we need to see Qatar also bring Rwanda into that so that it's a tripartite conversation between Rwanda, Congo, and the M23 rebels. Qatar, I think, at the moment is the only player that can get all of the key actors around the table.
that's
And,
quite
and, and
interesting. Yeah. Why do you think is Qatar taking up that role? Because they is there something to gain for them, or is it quite cynically thinking? I mean, or are they just into it for the piece itself?
Yeah, yeah. I think we should always operate on the assumption that these major actors are always doing it for their own self-interest. I mean, I think in Qatar's case, they seem to have less interest in the mineral extraction in Eastern DRC, and I think it's more about their soft power and their influence across Africa as a whole. They definitely have economic interest in other parts of the continent, but it doesn't seem to be in the Great Lakes. So I think they get involved in these peace processes because it burnishes their reputation. It frames them now as a, a key conduit, a key connecting state
Hmm.
in the region. They've used diplomacy in many other peace processes in
Yeah.
Africa, and in many respects, it's replacing
Hmm.
the likes of the European Union and the US in this terrain. So I think they're doing it mainly for geopolitical rather than directly
Are they,
economic reasons.
so it becomes now quite complex, or as you already promised it would be, because you say that we are starting to talk about the Great Lakes region, and now we're in Qatar and in Washington, etc. But is Qatar then, just to continue a little bit, is Qatar an independent geopolitical actor, do you think, or because they're always being put in the same box as Iran and China, etc., and Russia maybe, or Turkey, or I don't know. And the other question connected to that is, like, they also seem to be involved in conflict sometimes, in Syria, maybe also in Sudan, and they have, as an opposing part, they have done the Emirates. He said it seems, but I mean, it's very very blunt lines, and it's possibly much more complex than I suggest now. But um, is it an independent actor, and doesn't also could it not also generate exactly more rivalry between Qatar and the Emirates, the other side, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think most African states treat the Gulf states with some wariness. I don't think they see them as disinterested actors. They
No.
sometimes see them as the only possible avenue for peace, but
Yeah.
often only when they've exhausted all other possibilities. Now, in specifically in this example, one of the things that worries the Congolese government is that there is already an economic relationship between Rwanda and Qatar. So the Rwanda Air has now come under the banner of Qatar Airways. Qatar is involved in building the second international airport in Rwanda. There's a tight, increasingly tight economic relationship between the two states. Congo doesn't have the equivalent with Qatar. So I would say that Congo is reluctantly going to Doha to talk to M23 at the moment, but not quite believing that they could get something out of this. Uh, I think that's the pressure then on the Qatari government is you've got to keep Congo at the table. You're going to have to offer them something more concrete than what they're getting from these negotiations at the moment. But
Mhm.
there is a general wariness about any of these international powers getting involved
Mhm.
in these kind of peace processes.
So, and I mean, there's of course so much to ask, but one of the other questions that really comes up is, um, it seems that Congo is extremely weak. You already said that Congo doesn't have a parallel structure of international relations, and apparently in Washington the deal was made not in favor of Congo at all. So how come that a country that's so much bigger than Rwanda, Rwanda's just a very tiny nation bordering Congo, How come that it's that Congo is has remained so weak over the past decades?
Yeah, I think it points to some really deep structural dysfunctionalities in Congolese governance.
Mhm.
One of the things that Tshisekedi has really struggled with, since he became president 5, 6 years ago, is he spends so much time trying to keep his own party together and trying to keep his own parliament together. He's got this massive coalition, which is always at each other's throats. It really blocks Congo's ability to deliver functional governance. And one of the places where that plays out is international affairs. There's this constant incoherence between what we hear from Tshisekedi in Kinshasa and what we hear from his foreign minister or his peace envoys who get sent off to Washington and Doha. There have also been various summits where, at the very last minute, Tshisekedi and his senior people haven't turned up. So this happened in Rwanda last year. It happened in Doha only 6 months ago. So there is this general sense of dysfunctionality and sometimes chaos coming out of the Congolese state. In contrast, one of the things that characterizes Kagame's government in Rwanda is this absolutely steadfast level of organization and coherence. And they have built over time very effective international networks. So they go to Washington and they find open doors and open ears because they've been building those relationships for a very, very long time, and they come with a clear strategy and a clear
And
message. So
apparently also being able not to fall into one of the two major geopolitical camps at the moment.
Indeed, that
Yeah.
Rwanda, like several other African states, has played this sort of middle line
Mhm.
on Ukraine and on Russia remarkably well,
Mhm.
while also cultivating relationships with the likes of Brazil and India and China. And, I mean, this has been a big part of Rwanda's strategy for the last decade or so, has been this very flexible foreign relations approach where they basically will try to work with everybody. And that includes the European Union on the minerals deal. So they're very comprehensive in how they do this, and then that plays out in these peace processes too.
And what you can say is then that the West actually has no real leverage to sort of say we need these resources in a let's say human rights friendly way. Or they don't have leverage, but maybe also not the will because they just need them.
They just need them. They just
Yeah.
need them. And I
Mm.
think I think Rwanda realizes that. So Rwanda's very good at sniffing out the interest and the weaknesses of international
Mm.
partners.
Mm.
One of the other spaces we see that play out at the moment is Rwanda has made itself available for migration deals with
Yeah.
numerous international actors.
Yeah.
That wasn't on Rwanda's radar 5, 6 years ago, but they realized that the likes of the UK and now the US and potentially various European Union states like Denmark and Austria and even Germany, all
And
of
the
whom have
Netherlands have been talking about it. We have a
and the
discussion about
Netherlands
it. Yeah.
too have all sent delegations to
Yeah.
Kigali to see
Yeah.
whether these kind of deals are possible. So,
Mm.
Rwanda watches that and inserts itself very strategically. But
Mm.
that's crucial in terms of the violence in Eastern Congo at the moment, because you've got one of the key protagonists, namely the Rwandan state, that is also very adept at playing the international arena, and it gives the likes of Rwanda and M23 green light to continue committing the violence that they're committing in Eastern Congo. So there's this very direct link between Rwanda's international relations and then the violence that's going on in the region at the moment.
So what is the big plan? I mean, you say they're very organized and they know what they're doing. What's the big plan from Kigali, let's say, for the region and for especially Eastern Congo?
So that's very interesting because I traveling to Rwanda a lot, and I ask senior policymakers questions around this a lot. I have a distinct sense that Rwanda can't quite believe the gains that it's made in Congo in the last 18 months. To begin with, I think their objectives were quite limited. It was gain some control through M23 just across the border to maintain certain economic and political spheres of influence. What they perhaps underestimated was how quickly the Congolese state would collapse and how little international opposition there would be to their incursion. And so now, Rwanda's ambitions are growing by the day. I think they're realizing that they can control much more territory. It's much more lucrative for them than they ever anticipated. they don't want to control Eastern Congo directly. They'd rather do it through local actors, local intermediaries, which they've done that in the past. But they're now looking at a sphere of influence that extends hundreds of kilometers inside Congolese territory. They don't want to annex it formally, but that they want to control it in these informal ways.
Mm.
I think the Rwandan strategy is evolving by the day because they've seen a much greater opportunity than they expected was going to be there. So that also complicates the conflict. It means this is much more dynamic, potentially much more expansive, and therefore much longer lasting than anyone might have feared even a year ago.
So, do you think Rwanda is able to realize these, let's say, maximalist plans, or is there anything that could happen that could spoil these dreams?
Some of the things that would potentially disrupt the Rwandan plans would be serious international opposition, much more coherent international opposition. If Rwanda's major economic partners started to threaten various financial deals, that might put the brakes on. I guess the other potential spoiler for Rwanda's plans would be if the Congolese state finally got its act together. If it was able to play a much more adept game internationally and put more diplomatic pressure on, then that may change the dynamic as well. I guess the other one would be simply a drain on Rwandan resources. The reality is, as lucrative as the current situation is for Rwanda, that could hit a wall at some point. And the Rwandan economy is very small. It's highly vulnerable. Even minor economic fluctuations cause real anxiety in Kigali. If the war goes on too long and Rwanda eventually starts to see an economic hit, it may start to roll back some of what it's doing.
Mhm.
But none of those factors look likely at the moment. I think unfortunately we're probably looking at an M23-led conflict that will extend for at least the next year or two with a major death toll and a major impact on everyday Congolese.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think you would agree that the international community looks paralyzed with regards to this, as it looks paralyzed with regards to Ukraine, Israel, Sudan, many other places, no?
Indeed, indeed. And Rwanda knows that. Rwanda knows that global attention at the moment is on Gaza, it's on Ukraine. Maybe it has an eye on what's happening in Sudan. But what's happening in Congo is a long way down the pecking order. The other thing they know is that the election of Trump, the re-election of Trump, just as this conflict was beginning, was a huge boost to Rwanda's interests. That they knew that the US was not going to put pressure on them to extract themselves from the DRC.
Mhm.
They liked Trump's transactional approach to everything. They think that
Mhm.
that's a game that they can win. And so the international geopolitical situation very much favors Rwanda at the moment.
But isn't it also what I wonder? I mean, Kagame is, of course, a very crucial figure in this whole story. Um, just to give an example, maybe it's not fair, but to say Netanyahu is a very crucial figure in the war in the Middle East, the wars in the Middle East and Israel Palestine. It would, I mean, does it also not hinge on him? Like, let's say, what will happen if, I mean, eventually their reign, just like Netanyahu, someday it will end. Does it not? Does it not very too much, let's say, rely on one person to for a system to be, you know, durable?
The RPF is an incredibly resilient party, and I think yes, it would clearly have a big impact on the Rwandan state when Kagame leaves, either if he retires, which I think seems unlikely, or when he dies.
Mhm.
Um, but we shouldn't underestimate how common his ideology is within the party as a whole. What
Mhm.
he's surrounded himself with over time are political and military elites of a very similar mindset. Many of them grew up in exile in Uganda and the other neighboring states. Many of them had lived in refugee camps. Many of them fought on the front line in the Civil War in the 90s and were part of the struggle against the genocidal forces in 1994. They've come together, they've come to power as a group. Um, and so even if Kagame goes, there's a high likelihood of him being replaced by somebody whose strategies and objectives are very similar in that sense.
Yeah.
So, what always strikes me in Rwanda is that there's so little discussion now about the succession plan. No one expects any major change in this political setup, even if Kagame dies. There's a sense that someone very similar to Kagame is likely to come along, and the national and the regional strategies are unlikely to change.
Yeah. So, um, what we didn't touch upon, and which is also super interesting, is that, of course, Kagame came to power after and through a period of genocide. You said he also grew up in a refugee camp in Uganda, I believe. Um, it is quite a remarkable change from a country that underwent genocide to a country that seems to be a regional powerhouse for the moment, at least. Um, One aspect to this that people maybe know is that yeah, there has been a whole process of reconciliation through the Gacaca courts. Um, First of all, uh, yeah, what are these Gacaca courts exactly, and what did they do? Because I don't think the system is functional at the moment. No.
That's right. So the Gacaca courts were community level trials for genocide suspects between 2002 and 2012. So it was a decade long process. 400,000 suspects were prosecuted at that time. So it's arguably the largest transitional justice process that we've ever seen in a post-conflict society. Um, I followed that process really closely. I wrote a book towards the end of the Gacaca process based on fieldwork that I'd done really from day one of Gacaca. And what I saw village to village over that 10 years was a community dialogue. Week after week, communities coming together, arguing about what had happened during the genocide in that place. In these very open air, very energetic community trials. I'm writing another book on Rwanda at the moment, and I guess one of my key arguments is that Gacaca laid this really important basis for reconciliation, in the sense that it forced the country to confront the past in a very open and honest way. And it's a big reason why almost all of those convicted genocide perpetrators are now living back in exactly the same communities where they committed crimes in 1994. It's one of the remarkable things about the Rwandan case that you end up with hundreds of thousands of killers living side by side with the victims' families, often living in the same houses that they were living in
So
1994.
so
And
you can really say that this was a big success then.
I do think so. And I think the paradox of the situation is that I think you have a peaceful, stable situation inside Rwanda that might be heading towards something that looks like reconciliation, at the same time as Rwanda is directly involved in mass violence outside of its borders. And in some respects, that is the paradox of the region, that Rwanda, I would say, has done a remarkable job domestically and has done a disastrous job regionally.
Hmm.
Um, and there are two diametrically opposed responses to the genocide. Inside the country, the emphasis was, we have to find a cross-ethnic dialogue and a cross-ethnic response to the genocide that helps this country move forward peacefully and productively. Whereas beyond the borders, the response to the genocide was more violence. We're going to chase the Hutu perpetrators in Eastern Congo. We're going to develop proxy rebel groups that can ensure that those forces can never threaten the Rwandan state. And all of that has been going on simultaneously over the
Yeah.
last 20 or 30 years.
But the Gacaca process where that you describe, were they, let's say, grassroots movement, or were they sort of a top-down, sort of organized system of reconciliation?
So it was a government system. So it was formally part of the national criminal legal infrastructure. So the
Hmm.
state created Gacaca, but then wheeled out a system of 12,000 jurisdictions. And at the local level, all of the judges were lay people who were elected by their local communities. So there was this kind of hybrid nature to it. It was state orchestrated, but very communally owned. And one
Mhm.
of the things that always struck me when I was researching community after community was that every gacaca was very different as a result. It was dictated by the concerns of whatever the local community was that was in charge.
Mhm.
There were some places where the community really was still very violent and very unstable. And Gachacha became a place where people were just trying to calm down current conflicts. There were other places where Gachacha went very smoothly, and where the hearings were very predictable in many respects.
Mhm.
But that diversity was because there was this community ownership over the process, even though it was the state that had constructed the
Mhm.
process at the outset.
Yeah. And you described this big paradox of sort of being able to sort of create some sort of reconciliation within, while at the same time having a quite an aggressive policy outside. Um, what you also hear is that there's not so much, let's say, press freedom or freedom of speech inside Rwanda when it comes to sort of, let's say, talking about the RPF as a political force, etc. And so isn't there a paradox there then as well? And you also said like there's a great wealth being generated through the sale of resources, but it's also it's a small elite that is profiting and not the majority. Can you then really say that this is sort of a successful model in a way? Is it like not successful? Is it a sustainable model if you have this reconciliation in an environment that's quite divided, poor and rich, and also quite let's say not so open to public debate, to say it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that
Yeah.
might be putting it mildly,
Yeah.
in the sense that yes, it's a very repressive political environment, and people are very careful about criticizing the state. People feel a huge reluctance to talk about crimes that the RPF also committed, the ruling party also committed in the aftermath of the genocide. I think the best way to understand this, and this is something I'm talking about in my current book, um, is that the population tolerated a high degree of government control in the aftermath of the genocide because control and security was a primary objective of the population. People had lived through mass violence, they'd lived through chaos. There was an understanding that the state would have to be heavy-handed, would have to get to grips with the situation, and if that meant some sacrifice of civil liberties, then many people were willing to make that compromise. But that's changing over time. And I think the real challenge for the RPF at the moment is how do they adjust 30 years after the genocide to a very different perspective? In particular, how do they respond to the interests of a younger generation, much of which grew up after 1994? I mean, 75% of the Rwandan population today wasn't alive at the time of the genocide. And so it's younger Rwandans who have a very different idea about what the state should do, a very different idea of freedom and liberty, and are making different demands of the government. And what we're not seeing at the moment is an RPF that's willing to respond to that. They're still operating in many respects in the same way that they were in the 1990s. And now that's a risk. That's a risk. So I think what it suggests is that there's a set of government policies that may be appropriate or may be acceptable in the direct aftermath of conflict. But there comes a point where there has to be a new style of governance to respond to a different set of demands. And that's where I see a reluctance on the part of the RPF to adjust to the new dispensation. And that'll have big consequences, I think, for the national economy, for reconciliation and all of that. It's a big 5 or 10 years for Rwanda coming up.
Now, I think you stated somewhere that reconciliation is not really let's say favorite aim of many geopolitical actors who used to be implicated in some war or other, and that the big players are just not that interested in let's say local communities getting together after a war. They like to move on and build new states and whatever. How come that that there seems to be quite, I mean, there are, of course, very famous examples of South Africa, and I think there are multiple places where successful truth and reconciliation commissions have taken place. But still, it doesn't seem like regular business after wars to organize this or to promote this from outside. Why do you think there seems to be quite little interest in this very important topic?
Yeah, I think international actors have turned away from the reconciliation term in the last 20 years or so. It was very much in vogue because of South Africa in the
Yeah,
90s. But I
yeah,
think talking to a lot of international policymakers, I get a sense that they think reconciliation is a very fuzzy, very idealistic, sometimes even very theological term, and that perhaps it's overly idealistic.
mm,
And so there has been a tendency to talk more about things that are considered hard and concrete, like security. Even peace and peace building, I think, gets more purchase now than the word reconciliation. But the interesting thing that I find, and I've written about this quite a lot in the Rwandan context, is at the community level, people talk about reconciliation as a necessity.
mm,
They don't talk about it even as an ideal or something that they hope for in the future. They talk about it as something that is absolutely vital today. And the reason for that is many people will say, we had peaceful coexistence between 1973 and 1990. You know, for all intents and purposes, we lived peacefully, stably together for nearly 20 years. And then, because of various circumstances, the genocide happened and the country fell apart. So we need something more than just peacefully living together. And that's where reconciliation comes in. It comes in and says we have to actually grapple with history. We have to have a dialogue. There
mm,
has to be some justice attached to that. And we have to rebuild these relationships in a really
mm.
concerted way. Otherwise, we will see a repetition of violence. So
Yes.
I think what's interesting there is that the emphasis on reconciliation is not abstract and it's not idealistic. It's framed concretely as a current necessity.
Mm.
And it is connected to the idea of the non-recurrence of violence. And
Yes,
that's a
yes,
high
yes.
priority for many everyday Rwandans.
What it makes me think is that, it's good that it's taking place. It has to take place, and I agree that it's a necessity. But it's also tragic that the realization comes after a period of extreme violence and destruction. And yeah, if you look at our societies, I mean, we can be glad that we are not currently sort of involved across our borders. We are involved in wars, but let's say within our borders, there's no violence and there seems to be peace and security, etc. But even in our societies, you can see tensions moving. There's big rifts in society and populist discourses versus traditionalist versus all sorts of narratives about society that blame certain parts of the population for all the evils and troubles, etc. That could lead to some sort of violence in which shape or form it may take. And people are, I think, um, with reason, afraid also for the West in that sense, because tensions are running quite deep. If you talk about Islamophobia or you talk about the discourse around migration, or if you or the blame being put on certain populations. Um, so this raises the question of reconciliation means that something has gone wrong and you try to connect together. But can't we sort of learn something from the Gacaca process already before it goes wrong, let's say, in society?
Yeah, I've often joked with political leaders and judicial leaders in Rwanda that they should take Gacaca on the road globally,
Yeah, yeah,
and really talk more about it and
yeah.
and how they did it and why it's important. I think one of the big lessons from Gacaca was the importance of people having spaces um, to argue, to debate, to cross divides in a controlled environment
Mm,
with some very adept mediation. and also the time. One of the things that characterized Gacaca was a conversation that lasted a decade. And
mm,
it was very messy. It was very unpredictable. It was often re-traumatizing for people. But in the long term, I think it was necessary.
mm,
And we don't see that a lot in transitional justice institutions around the world. I mean, even the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for all of its successes, if you look at it, it was still mainly a perpetrator-focused institution emphasizing confession
mhm,
with very little direct exchange between
mhm,
victims and perpetrators. And
mhm.
of course, international courts, international justice is famously terrible at constructing anything that looks like a dialogue. Gacaca was different. Gacaca said, we're going to bring this whole process down into the village courtyard and we're going to encourage people to talk. And yes, there is a legal objective, which is to prosecute these suspects, but also the system was flexible enough and diverse enough, diffuse enough to bring in the community voices. And
Mhm.
these hearings would go for hours and people just talked. And I think there's something really basic and valuable in that. Now, if I look at, places like the US where I was recently, the UK where I now work, and Australia where I'm from
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
originally, these are three societies at the moment where we are starting to see violence across all sorts of political divides.
Mhm.
And the violence, thankfully, at the moment seems quite localized, but there's
Yeah.
nothing to say that it won't become more extreme as
Mhm.
polarization increases.
Mhm.
There is something, I think, from the Gacaca experience about how you construct spaces, local spaces where people can talk.
Yeah.
And it seems a very basic thing, this emphasis on dialogue, but I do think that it's lacking in many countries at the world, and we may reap some really destructive
Well, yeah.
destructive outcomes from that.
The hard thing seems to sort of to have a space where everyone feels welcome because people feel easily that there is some sort of ideology behind, or you want to try to force some point on other people. I mean, we have debate centers in the Netherlands, but they're
Yeah,
maybe seen as left wing or right wing or whatever.
yeah,
So
yes,
it's a
yes.
challenge to sort of open spaces that everyone would feel as a
That's right. And who mediates those spaces is
yeah.
absolutely central. One of the things that Gacaca did very well was the fact that the judges had been locally elected by their
Mhm.
communities and were
Mhm.
everyday people. They
Yeah.
weren't professional judges,
No,
they weren't
no.
professional lawyers. They were trusted. They were trusted by those local
Yeah.
communities. They were often people they'd been school teachers or they'd been doctors or they'd worked in
Mhm.
clinics or
Mhm.
they were people who had some local legitimacy and were
Yeah.
considered the right people to mediate these discussions. Absolutely. I've looked a little bit at those debate clubs in the Netherlands, and there are some equivalents here in the UK. And the thing that always limits them is the perception of who's in charge,
Yes.
of
Yeah.
who's running them, what agendas there are that
Yeah.
behind them. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
if these dialogue spaces are going to work, they have to be led by people who have a broad-based legitimacy, and that can
Yeah.
be difficult to find in these very
Well,
polarized times.
even people who can say I'm neutral are being perceived as
Yeah.
part of because neutrality is increasingly seen as taking a position when it comes to either Gaza or these very heavy things that we deal with current society. If you say I'm neutral towards it, you already have a part against you because how can you be neutral if this and this happens or whatever? So even neutrality is suspect at some point. Yeah,
Exactly. And we
yeah,
live in a social media era
yeah,
when people get criticized very rapidly and stories about particular individuals spread
yeah,
rapidly. It can be very difficult to find
yeah.
these key actors. There's one other thing in relation to Gacaca that I also think might have some global resonance. And
Mhm,
again, this is something I'm looking at in my current book project is not just those community trials, but the other thing that was happening at the same time in Rwanda that I think has been very important for reconciliation has been the socioeconomic welfare system.
mm,
The other thing that the RPF did very successfully was they built a welfare state that genuinely spread the benefits across the ethnic divide. And in some respects, having written a book on Gacaca 15 years ago, I feel like I made a mistake, which is I should have been equally looking at what was happening in the socioeconomic space. Because what I understand better now, and I've been a bit slow to realize this, is it's the two things together. It's the dialogue of Gacaca, but it's the change in people's material circumstances, the question of inequality at the same time. Now, that is clearly an issue globally at the moment because underpinning so many of the cultural antagonisms that we're seeing in so many countries is a growing sense of the haves and the have-nots, a
Absolutely.
growing sense of inequality and the failure of governments everywhere
Mm.
to deal with socioeconomic divisions.
Yeah,
Um, and so, again, I think even on
yeah.
that level, Rwanda might have something to teach the world about you've got to start to make a change not just to people's understanding of history and how they can talk about it, but also to their day-to-day material circumstances. And that then starts to provide the basis for something that looks like reconciliation.
I absolutely agree, and I think it's a major cause of trouble and divisions in the West. But again, I mean, it's even this is taken up as a polarizing issue because if you say this, you might be seen as a communist or I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, but
Yes.
I agree very much that it's very much a basis. So thank you very much. If to just to close off, is there any like if people listen to this and I think I also want to somehow contribute either to sort of I am concerned about the divisions in society and the tensions that it brings. Like, how could they start doing something in your perspective?
I, I think it starts immediately at two different levels. One is just how we conduct ourselves as individuals in our daily life. It's how we talk to our neighbors. It's how we engage with people in the public space. I think that's crucial, and I think we underestimate that. That so much of this begins with just day-to-day behavior and discourse in the supermarket, in the street.
Mhm. Mhm.
But the next level is the importance of all the associations and institutions that we belong to. Whether that's churches, whether that's universities, whether that's NGOs, whether that's trade unions, whether it's political parties. Again, having a basic ethic of tolerance, discourse, debate, civil debate. We're going to disagree on things, but can we do it in a constructive fashion? Online, how we behave online. And I say this as someone who I'm often very antagonistic. My wife always tells me, put the phone away. You're just picking another fight on Twitter. But there's a deeper point there, which is, to get it.
You mean on where do you do this online
Yeah,
or
I do it
on X
on
or
Twitter and X, and I've actually
no.
had to get off X
Yeah,
for,
no.
for months now because I think I was becoming part of the problem. I
It's
felt
bad for your health. Yeah.
it's really bad for the health, and I think
Yeah.
I was maybe fueling some antagonisms. Here I was writing on peace and reconciliation, and I was
Yeah.
fighting online. It's so
I yeah.
I was really chastened by that, and thought that that's right. I've got to stop doing that. I've got to behave more peacefully in
Yeah.
the online space
Yeah.
while I'm advocating, operating more peacefully out in the street. And so, I think we all need to do that too, because a lot of people, myself included, are perhaps fueling conflicts sometimes in ways we don't fully recognize.
Yeah. Well, those are very wise words. Thank you very much, Phil. I enjoyed the conversation very much, and thanks for your insight into a conflict that might seem very far apart and very far away, but has a lot of connections with the way we live here and our own conflicts in our society. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Jakob.